So once again, a very warm welcome to our distinguished lecture this afternoon. I'm Pauline Lanet, Director of the Web Science Institute and one of the co-directors of the Work Futures Research Centre. We're particularly pleased today to welcome you to what is actually a couple of firsts. This is the first jointly hosted distinguished lecture between the Web Science Institute and the Work Futures Research Centre. And it's the first WSI distinguished lecture to be held online. So we'd actually booked today's speaker, Dr. Daniel Susskind, well before the outbreak of the pandemic, and we're obviously looking forward to hosting him on campus. But as it happens, Daniel's research expertise, the impact of technology and automation on our working lives, couldn't be more fitting to the current online working world in which we all now find ourselves. So I'm delighted to welcome our speaker today, Daniel Susskind of Balliol College, University of Oxford. Daniel is the author of 2 books exploring how technology will transform work, careers, and working lives and identities. The Future of the Professions was co-authored with Richard Susskind, and more recently, A World Without Work, Technology, Automation, and How We Should Respond. Like many of us whose research focuses on the interface between work and technology, as well as all of us working in the current moment, recent events have thrown a new light on our relationship with technology and are raising questions, really important questions, on what work might look like when, or perhaps I should say if, the pandemic is behind us. So I know we're all fascinated to hear Daniel talk about the future of work in the age of COVID-19. Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction. It's a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon to talk to you about the future of work in the age of COVID-19. And what I want to do is I want to begin with a story. The Great Manure Crisis of 1890s, it should have come as no surprise. For some time in big cities like London and New York, the most popular forms of transport had relied upon horses, hundreds of thousands of them, to heave cabs, carts, wagons, and a variety of other vehicles through the streets. With these horses came manure, and lots of it. One enthusiastic health officer working in Rochester, New York, calculated that the horses in his city alone produced enough to cover an area of land to a height of 175 feet, almost as high as the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Apocryphally, people at the time extrapolated from these calculations to an inescapably manure-filled future. A New York commentator who predicted that piles would soon reach the height of 3rd-story windows. A London reporter who imagined that by the middle of the 20th century, the streets would be buried under 9 feet of the stuff. It said that policymakers did not know what to do. They couldn't simply ban horses from the streets. The animals were far too economically important. But the twist in the tale is that in the end, policymakers didn't need to worry. In the 1870s, the first internal combustion engine was built. In the 1880s, it was installed in the first automobile. And only a few decades later, Henry Ford brought cars to the mass market with his famous Model T. By 1912, New York had more cars than horses. 5 years after that, the last horse-drawn tram was decommissioned in the city. The Great Manure Crisis was over. The parable of horseshit, as Elizabeth Kolber called it in The New Yorker, has been told many times over the years. In most versions of the tale, the decline of horses is cast in an optimistic light, as a tale of technological triumph. But for Wassily Leontief, the Russian-American economist who won the Nobel Prize in 1973, the statement suggested a far more unsettling conclusion. What he saw instead was how a new technology, the combustion engine, had taken a creature that for millennia had played a central role in economic life and banished it to the sidelines. Then, in a set of articles written in the early 1980s, Leontief made one of the most infamous claims in modern economic thought. What technological progress had done to horses, he said, it would eventually do to human beings as well, drive us out of work. What cars and tractors were to them, computers and robots would be to us. Today, the world is gripped again by Leontief's fear. In the US, 30% of workers now believe their jobs are likely to be replaced by robots and computers in their lifetime. In the UK, the same proportion think it could happen in the next 20 years. And in the book that was mentioned at the start, A World Without Work, what I try and do is explain why we now have to take these sorts of fears seriously. Not always their substance, as we shall see, but certainly their spirit. Will there be enough well-paid work for everyone to do in the 21st century? This is, I think, one of the great questions of our time. And in the book, A World Without Work, I try and explain why I think the answer is no, and why the threat of technological unemployment is real. Now, at the outset, it's worth saying that I don't think there's going to be some dramatic technological big bang in the coming years, after which lots of people wake up and suddenly find themselves without work. That's unlikely to happen. Work is going to remain for some time to come. But what I do worry about is that as we move through the 21st century, more and more people might find that they're unable to make the sorts of economic contributions to society that they might have hoped or expected to make in the 20th century. And this is the idea that I want to explore today. And perhaps most importantly, I want to explain why the ideas in this book that I wrote and was published at the start of the year are really so important for thinking about the COVID-19 crisis that we now currently find ourselves involved in. So what I want to do in the next half hour or so are 5 different things. The first is I want to talk for a little while about machine capabilities, what it is that systems and machines are capable of doing, and why it is that economists have tended to underestimate the capabilities of machines. I then want to share with you some ideas about this concept of technological unemployment, the idea that people might be displaced from their work by increasingly capable systems and machines. I want to set out what I think are the 3 problems that we will face in a world with less work. I want to explain why, in spite of these problems, I nevertheless remain optimistic about the future. And then I want to explain how all of these ideas relate to this challenge of COVID-19 that we find ourselves in at present. So first, machine capabilities. What do the tasks of driving a car, making a medical diagnosis, and identifying a bird at a fleeting glimpse have in common? Well, these are all tasks that at one point leading economists thought couldn't readily be automated, and yet today they increasingly can be. Almost all car manufacturers have driverless car programs. There are countless systems that can diagnose medical problems, and there's even an app that if you give it if you take a photo of a bird, it can tell you at a fleeting glimpse what type of bird it is. Now, in my work, I argue that this wasn't simply a case of bad luck on the part of economists. They were wrong, and the reason why they were wrong is very important. They were relying on a mistaken assumption about machine capabilities, the belief that machines had to copy the way that human beings think and reason in order to outperform them. When these economists were trying to determine what tasks machines could and could not do, they imagined the only way to automate a task was to sit down with a human being, get them to articulate, explain how it was they performed that particular task, and then write a set of instructions based on that human explanation for machines to follow. This particular view was very popular in the field of artificial intelligence a few decades ago too. And I know this personally because my dad, a co-author in writing my previous book, The Future of the Professions, Richard Susskind, wrote his doctorate in the 1980s on artificial intelligence and the law. He was really part of the vanguard, co-developing the world's first ever commercially available AI system in law. Now, this was the home screen design for that system. He assures me this was a cool screen design back in the 1980s. Never been entirely convinced of that. They published it in the form of 2 floppy disks, the system, at a time when floppy disks genuinely were still floppy. And his approach was exactly the same as the economists. Sit down with lawyers, get them to explain to you how it was they solved legal problems, and then build a system based on that explanation for others to use. What was essentially a gigantic decision tree. And this tree had about 4 million branches through it that my dad and his colleagues had manually, painstakingly crafted. So economists hadn't plucked their view of machine capabilities out of thin air. They were very closely following a view that had been dominant in the field of AI for some time. The belief that building a machine to perform a given task meant observing a human being performing that same task and then trying to copy them. These traditional AI researchers in whose footsteps economists were following were what I call purists, who closely observed human beings acting intelligently and tried to build machines in their image. Some tried to replicate the actual structure of the human brain. Others tried a more psychological approach and tried to replicate the thinking processes that human beings appeared to be engaged in. A third approach was to try and draw out the rules that human beings appeared to follow. And this final one was the particular view of machine capabilities that economists had adopted. And it was based on this view, economists argued, that if a human being could explain how it was they performed a particular task, if they could readily articulate the rules that they followed, then that task was routine. These were the tasks that could be automated. Otherwise, tasks where human beings could not explain themselves, these were non-routine tasks and out of reach of machines. Now, this distinction is widespread today. Think how often you hear the claim that machines can only perform tasks that are repetitive and predictable, rules-based and well-defined. These are just different words for routine. And those 3 tasks that I mentioned at the start, those are all classic cases of non-routine task. Ask a doctor how she makes a medical diagnosis, for instance, and she might be able to give you a few rules of thumb, but ultimately she would struggle. She'd say it was experience, instinct, creativity, judgment. And these faculties are very difficult to explain. And so it was thought very hard to automate. If a human being cannot explain to you how it is they perform a particular task, where on earth do we begin, people worried, in writing a set of instructions for a machine to follow? 30 years ago, this view was right. But today it's looking shaky, and in the future, I argue it's simply going to be wrong. Advances in processing power, data storage capability, and algorithm design, particularly in the field of machine learning, mean that this routine versus non-routine distinction is going to be diminishingly meaningful. So take the task of medical diagnosis again. A system was recently developed at Stanford that if you give it a photo of a freckle, it will tell you as accurately as leading dermatologists whether or not that freckle is cancerous. How does it work? It's not trying to replicate the judgment or the creativity of a doctor. It knows or understands nothing about medicine at all. Instead, it's running a pattern recognition algorithm through about 129,450 past cases, hunting for similarities between those cases and the photo of the particular troubling lesion in question that you've given it. It's performing the task in an unhuman way, based on the analysis of more possible cases than any human doctor could hope to review in their lifetime. It doesn't matter any longer that the human being couldn't explain themselves. Now, there are some who really do dwell upon the fact that these machines are not built in our image. And to see this, take the story of IBM's Watson, the computer system that rose to fame when it went on the US quiz show Jeopardy in 2011. And as many people know, of course, it beat the two human champions at Jeopardy. Now, what's so interesting about this, looking back on it many years later, is that the day after Watson won on Jeopardy, John Searle, the great philosopher, wrote this piece in the Wall Street Journal with the title, "Watson Doesn't Know It Won on Jeopardy." And it's great, and it's true. You know, Watson didn't let out a cry of excitement. It didn't call up its parents to say what a good job it had done. It didn't want to go down to the proverbial pub for a drink. The system wasn't copying the way that those human contestants played, but it didn't matter. It still outperformed them. That Watson victory was clearly a practical victory, but it was also an ideological victory as well, an ideological triumph. When my dad was working on AI, back then, most AI researchers were purists. Again, closely observing human beings, acting intelligently, and trying to build machines like them. But that was not how Watson was designed. Its creators didn't set out to copy the anatomy of human players. It didn't try and copy the reasoning they engaged in. It didn't try and copy the rules that they followed. Instead, these researchers were pragmatists, taking a task that might have required intelligence when performed by a human being and building a machine to perform it in a fundamentally different way. And a generation of systems have now been crafted, have now been built in this pragmatist spirit, crafted to function very differently from human beings, judged not by how they perform a task, but by how well they perform a task. And this is the argument that I make in the book, that, and the mistake that I think economists have made. This is why they have systematically underestimated the capabilities of machines. Their view of machine capabilities, which that routine versus non-routine distinction so heavily relies upon, was a purist one. They believed that machines had to copy the way that human beings thought and reasoned. But given the technological progress that's taken place in recent years, that's no longer the case. Today's most capable machines no longer ride on the coattails of human intelligence. In crafting that routine versus non-routine distinction, economists were on the wrong side of what I call the pragmatist revolution, drawing on ideas about machine capabilities that no longer held. So what should replace the routine versus non-routine distinction? Lots of recent scholarly work, books, articles, and reports have sought to work out the new limits of machine capabilities, and they've used a variety of different approaches to do this. But the obvious problem with trying to mark out the limits of machines is that any conclusions you reach are going to become outdated pretty quickly. Those who try and identify those boundaries are like the proverbial painters of the Fourth Rail Bridge in Scotland, a bridge so long, those painters supposedly had to start repainting it as soon as they got to the end, because by then the paint would have already begun to peel. Spend time trying to come up with a sensible, consistent account of what machines can do today, and by the time you finish, you're probably going to have to start again and readjust. So I think a better way to think about technology is to stop trying to identify specific limits. It's too difficult to say exactly what it is that machines are going to be capable of in the future. But I do think it's pretty certain that they're going to be able to do more than they can today. Over time, machines are gradually, but relentlessly, going to advance further and further into the realm of tasks and activities performed by human beings. And I think this is a more valuable way to think about technological progress. And I call this far more general trend task encroachment. And when you look at the three main capabilities that human beings draw on in their work, manual capabilities that involve dealing with the physical world, cognitive capabilities that draw on our ability to think and reason, affective capabilities, our capacity for feeling and emotion, what you see are machines gradually encroaching on more and more tasks that require each of these capabilities. And if you have a look at the book, you'll see hundreds of examples of this process of task encroachment underway. And it's this process of task encroachment that has important implications for thinking about the impact of technology on work. And that's what I want to turn to now. Now, in my work, I distinguish between two different types of technological unemployment, two different ways people might find themselves without work because of technological progress. And the first is what I call frictional technological unemployment. Here, there's still work to be done. The problem is that not all workers are able to reach out and take up that work. And there are three main reasons that I explore for this in my work. Three main reasons people might find themselves in this situation of frictional technological unemployment. The first reason people might find work sitting out their reach is what I call the skills mismatch, where displaced workers simply don't have the skills required for the new work created by technological progress. And this is probably the most familiar reason for frictional technological unemployment, so I won't dwell on that for much longer. A second reason is what I call place mismatch, and here displaced workers find themselves not living in the same place as the new work that's created. And this is a second reason for frictional technological unemployment. Now, it's worth remembering that in the early days of the internet, there really was a moment when it seemed like these sorts of worries about location would no longer matter. People spoke about the death of distance and how the world is flat. But actually, in looking for work today, the place where you live matters more than ever. But there's also a third mismatch responsible for frictional technological unemployment. And this is what I call the identity mismatch. And here, displaced workers have an identity rooted in a very particular type of work, and they're willing to stay unemployed in order to protect that identity. So think of adult men in the US, for instance, displaced from manufacturing roles by new technologies. Some say they would prefer not to work at all than to take up so-called pink-collar work, a really unfortunate term, but designed to capture the fact that many of the roles currently out of reach of machines are disproportionately held by women. So 97.7% of teachers, preschool and kindergarten teachers in the US are women, 92.2% of nurses, 82.5% of social workers. Now, I think most of us tend to be comfortable with this idea of frictional technological unemployment. We can readily picture a future where there's lots of work to be done, but because of the sorts of mismatches that I've described, displaced workers are unable to take up that work. But as we move through the 21st century, I think we may see the emergence of a second type of technological unemployment, one where there's simply not enough well-paid work to be done, full stop. And this I call structural technological unemployment. And this, I think, is a less comfortable idea. Now, the starting point, of course, for thinking about whether something like this is actually possible has to be the fact that ever since modern economic growth began, almost 3 centuries ago, people have worried about the economic harm caused by new technologies, and yet time and time again, those worries have turned out to be misplaced. And I spend a lot of time in my work trying to explain why, given the remarkable technological changes that have taken place, this time really is different. And the threat of structural technological unemployment really is possible. Now, if we find ourselves in a world with less work, either because of frictional technological unemployment or because of the structural technological unemployment, it's going to create 3 problems. And I want to just share what I think those problems are with you now. The first is the fundamental economic challenge. And to me, it's the challenge of inequality. I don't think it's a coincidence that today worries about economic inequality are intensifying at exactly the same time that automation anxiety is growing. These 2 problems, inequality and technological unemployment, are very closely related. Today, the labor market is the main way that we share our income in society. It's the main way we share out our prosperity. Most people's jobs are their main, if not their only, source of income. The vast inequalities that we already see in the labor market, with some workers receiving far more for their efforts than others, show that this approach is already creaking. Technological unemployment is simply a more extreme version of that story, but one that ends with some workers receiving nothing at all. So I see this challenge of a world with less work as fundamentally a challenge of inequality, a distributional challenge. How do we share out material prosperity when our traditional way of doing so, paying people for the work that they do, is less effective than it was in the past? The second problem actually has very little to do with economics at all, I think. In the future, our lives are likely to become dominated by a small number of large technology companies who are responsible for developing all these technologies in the first place. In the 20th century, our main concern about large corporations was their economic power. We were concerned about things like market concentration, excessive profits, predatory pricing. In the 21st century, I think we're going to be far more concerned with their political power, their impact on things like liberty and democracy and social justice. So take one example, Facebook. Yes, there are people today who are concerned about the economic power of Facebook, but I think people are far more concerned about their political power. That Russians, for instance, were able to buy ads on the platform to influence the 2016 presidential election. In a study of over 3,000 anti-refugee attacks in Germany, researchers found that regions with higher Facebook usage experienced significantly more attacks. These are not concerns about economics, they're concerns about politics. It's concerns about the impact that these large technology companies have on the social scaffolding with which all of us live on which all of us live our lives. And it worries me sometimes that a lot of this work in thinking about the power of large companies is done by economists, because I don't think this is primarily an issue for antitrust authorities or competition authorities. The problem is a political one. It's not an economic one. And the economists who tend to populate our agencies who are traditionally concerned with these large companies are not the right people, I think, for grappling with this challenge. The conceptual tools that we as economists use to think about things like prices and profits, however revealing, don't really tell us anything about issues of liberty, democracy, and social justice, and whether or not those principles are under threat. The third challenge I think that we'll find ourselves with in a world with less work is the challenge of meaning, the challenge of finding meaning in life. It's often said that work isn't simply a means to a wage, but it's a source of purpose as well. And if this is right, then technology may not only hollow out the labor market, but it might also hollow out the sense of meaning and purpose that many people have in their lives as well. And that, I think, is the third challenge that we'll find ourselves facing in a world with less work. And yet, in spite of all of this, as I said at the outset, I remain optimistic about the future. And I want to say now why that is. And the reason is simple, which is that in decades to come, technological progress is likely to solve the economic problem that has dominated humanity until now. If we think of the economy as a pie, the traditional economic challenge has been, how do we make that pie large enough for everyone to live on? At the turn of the 1st century AD, if you'd taken the global economic pie and divided it up into equal slices for everyone in the world, most people would have got a few hundred of today's dollars. Almost everyone lived on or around the poverty line. And if you were to roll forward 1,000 years, then roughly the same would have been true. But over the last few hundred years, economic growth has soared. And this growth has been driven by technological progress. Economic pies around the world have become much bigger. Today, global GDP per capita, the value of those individual slices of the pie, is already about $10,720. Roll forward another 35 years and it will be double that, another 35 years and double that again. Economist A.K. Albraith so lyrically put it, man has escaped for the moment the poverty which was for so long his all-embracing fate. And so technological unemployment, in a strange way, will be a symptom of that success. In the 21st century, technological progress is going to solve one problem, the question of how to make that pie large enough for everyone to live on. But as we've seen, I think it's going to replace it with those three other problems, the problems of inequality, the problems of power, and the problems of purpose. And clearly there's going to be huge disagreement about what we ought to do, about how we should share out prosperity, constrain the political power of big tech, and provide meaning in a world where there may be less work. But I think in the final analysis that these are far more attractive problems to have to grapple with than the one that haunted our ancestors for centuries, which was how do we make that pie large enough in the first place? And now this brings me to our current crisis, the crisis of COVID-19. What I found particularly striking in thinking about those challenges that I thought we'd face in the 21st century because of automation, those challenges of inequality, of power, and of meaning, we now find ourselves in this very moment facing them because of this pandemic. First, the economic challenge, inequality. Robots haven't taken all the jobs, but COVID-19 has completely decimated the demand that so many of those jobs rely upon. And so we find ourselves asking exactly this question: how can we share out prosperity in society when our traditional way of doing so, paying people in the labor market, is less effective than it was in the past? Or then there's the issue of power. I think it's a very conspicuous feature of economic life at this moment that a small number of large companies, and in particular technology companies, are doing very well during this crisis. And yet many of the small businesses, which make up the backbone of our economic lives, are struggling. And then finally, there's the issue of meaning and purpose. I think it's been very interesting in the last few months seeing how much has been written about how we ought to best spend our time in this sort of enforced idleness that we currently find ourselves in. I think it's become clear that while many of us have a very good sense of what gainful employment looks like, I don't think we have a good sense of what gainful unemployment looks like. I think that's been another consequence of this pandemic. So I think Andrew Yang, the one-time presidential candidate, put it nicely when he said, I should have been talking about a pandemic instead of automation, because I think it is quite striking how these challenges that I thought we'd face with escalating severity as we move through the 21st century, we now face right now because of this pandemic. But if we look further ahead and think about the medium term, what do we think the next 12 to 18 months is going to look like? And what's the role of technology? And here, I think it's very clear that there's no going back to the pre-COVID-19 economy. You know, that world is now gone. There was a moment at the start of this crisis where we thought that we might be able to return to that world. The view was that we'd see a peak in cases within a matter of weeks. We'd put the economy into a sort of suspended animation, but once the virus had passed, we could quickly return to economic life as usual. Some people called it the great vacation would be over. And I think it's really very clear now that that isn't going to happen, that this virus is going to be with us for some time. And so as we look further ahead, I think it's useful to think in terms of two different futures. The first is what I call the vaccine future. And in this future, we find a vaccine or indeed an effective treatment in the next 12 to 18 months. But even here, I don't think we'll see a return to the pre-COVID-19 economy. And the reason is this, which is that one way to think about what we're currently engaged in is that we're currently taking part in a sort of massive, unplanned pilot scheme in the use of technology. And what we're going to find is that some things simply don't work well at all, some technological interventions, but we're also going to find other things do work well. And I think once this pandemic passes, in that first future, it's very unlikely we're not going to embed some of these technologies in the way that we work in the years to come. So just take one example, doctors. Last year, fewer than 1% of appointments were done remotely. At the moment, about 93% of appointments are being done remotely. And I think it's unimaginable that once this crisis passes, we'll see a return to the sort of face-to-face interactions at the level that we used to have them. We have companies like Twitter, for instance, saying that they're going to allow all their employees to work from home forever. There is going to be a technological legacy, even if we find a vaccine. But more troubling, I think, from the point of view of automation is a second future, the no vaccine future. The pandemic has created a very strong incentive to automate the work of human beings. A machine, after all, doesn't have to follow social distancing rules. It's not going to get infected and fall ill, doesn't have to socially isolate to protect its peers. This incentive to replace people with machines has clearly got stronger in this crisis. But for now, this incentive is pretty much kept in check by the really quite radical measures that have been adopted around the world to try and encourage employers to keep their employees on their books. So the British government, for instance, as many people will know, of course, is paying up to 80% of the wages of millions of workers, underwriting a huge part of the economy. My fear, though, is that once this state support is wound down, as inevitably it will be, that incentive to automate is going to be unleashed, and it's going to get far stronger. And so in the absence of a vaccine, I can't see how that incentive diminishes. So in either future, these are the challenges I think we'll face now. Looking ahead, I think we've got to think seriously about both a vaccine and a no vaccine future. And in both of them, I think there's no return to a pre-COVID-19 world. I think in both of them, technology plays a really important role, but for very different reasons. So I will finish there. Thank you very much, everyone, for your attention this afternoon. And I look forward now to taking some questions and hearing some reactions as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Daniel, for an absolutely fascinating talk, very, very thought-provoking and very stimulating. I'm going to open up the chat now, or the chat will be opened up. So I'd like to invite people, please, to start posting your questions. I'm sure there'll be lots and lots of questions from a whole range of disciplines. And while we're waiting for the questions to appear, I suppose the key one that it occurs to me is about the role of agency. And to what extent do we have agency, to what extent in your view, do we have agency over the crafting and writing of our futures? I mean, obviously there's a kind of underlying technological determinism about a dystopian view of the future, perhaps, where technology is an unstoppable train, which is on a path, and we have little agency to stop it. There's another, perhaps more utopian future, or utopian view of the future, is that we are involved in the writing of it. We are involved in the crafting of it. And I agree that on the one hand, perhaps the current crisis has underlined the importance and the affordances of technology in being able to save us from close physical contact and carry on tasks and abilities without having to be face to face. But on the other hand, I think it's really exposed the real need for social contact, and the fact that people value the social very, very highly. People don't want to have their hand held by a robot as they're dying. They enjoy the delivery people coming and bringing their goods. It's actually been really interesting how many tasks have been re-evaluated and reappraised because of their social content. And there's been a slight sort of disentangling of previous structural hierarchies in terms of occupations and a re-evaluation. So I suppose it's the question of agency. It doesn't have to be any particular way. We are authors of our own destinies.
Yeah. So really, I have two really interesting questions there. I mean, on the issue of technological determinism, I'm not a technological determinist. I don't think, to use your railroad analogy, that the sort of rails of the future are set in front of us for us to just blindly trundle along. So I'm not a technological determinist, but I think I am a technological realist, which is that in the future, our systems and machines are going to be more capable than they are today. My view is that over time, gradually but relentlessly, more and more tasks and activities, many of which we thought were out of reach of machines, will fall within their reach. So for me, I start from that position of, well, what are the consequences of this process of task encroachment, which I just think is inevitable. But I think you're exactly right that the way in which we, in my view, the agency comes in how we respond. As a society, how do we respond to this technological trend? So I'm a sort of determinist in the sense that I think this technological trend is going to happen. But and the agency comes in the response, and a big part of my work is about how we ought to respond. And I think what's been quite interesting in this pandemic is that many of the responses that I set out in the book as responses to a world with less work because of automation have found themselves very relevant because we find ourselves in a world with less work because of this pandemic. And many of the ideas that I set out as being radical, or set out and was accused of being too radical, are now completely mainstream in thinking about how we respond to this pandemic. The question of the reevaluation and is really interesting. And I should say, I don't, people who pick up the book expecting an account of some technological big bang where everything that we do is going to be done by machines are going to be disappointed. There are going to be tasks that we can't automate. There are going to be tasks that we can automate but aren't profitable to automate. And there are going to be tasks that we could automate, but for various reasons we choose not to. And I think you're exactly right that in this crisis, we've seen certain tasks and activities which involve this interpersonal interaction being reevaluated. But I think it works in both directions. I think we've realized the value of human interaction for particular tasks. But equally, I think we've also realized that for other tasks where we thought it was indispensable, it turns out not to be.
Yeah.
And the example of 93% of doctors doing checkups remotely, I think is a good example of that. There's still an interpersonal interaction, but 6 months ago, if you had said that to a doctor, said, hey, you need to be in the room, you need to get a feel for the patient, you need to be able to look into their eyes. And I think across economic life, we've seen that reevaluation in both directions. Many people realize they don't need a tax accountant to sit down in front of. There's various systems that people can use online that are just as effective, and the personal touch turned out not to be that important. So I think there's a reevaluation in many directions, but inevitably we're going to find that there are certain tasks, and that's what I said, we're in a pilot scheme. We're going to find out that there are certain things that we just can't automate for various reasons. And one piece of advice I think for many people, and particularly those involved in whether you're an academic or you're involved in the business world, or is to be collecting data at the moment, to be treating it as a pilot, so that once this passes, we can look back and evaluate what it was that was happening, what worked, what didn't, what it revealed.
Yeah. Thank you. There's absolutely loads of questions coming in. Someone asked about developing countries. In terms of the challenges you see, what is your perspective about developing countries? Yeah.
And one of the things that I've become more and more concerned about during this crisis, and it relates to the work on automation, but it's more relating to the response to the pandemic, has been the lack of international cooperation. We haven't seen the sort of cooperation between countries in responding to this pandemic that we needed to see. And in particular, many developing countries simply don't have the capabilities to respond to this crisis effectively. And I think as an international community, we're not doing enough to support those countries in that response. So one of the things that I've become more and more concerned in, and I spent more and more time thinking about over the last few weeks, is around international cooperation and how it is that we deal with these global problems. We live at a time when, on the one hand, there's this kind of political impulse to say that borders are more important than ever, nations matter, but on the other hand, we've got global problems that simply don't respect those borders, and there's this great tension between those two different positions. And my worry for developing countries, it's not simply a worry about automation or a worry about this pandemic, but it's a worry about climate change, it's a worry about the global regulation of large companies, is that unless we have a framework that supports effective international cooperation, we're not going to be able to do enough on any of those global problems.
Ruth H says, when you talk about work, you're really talking about employment and jobs. Is there space for growth in meaningful work, such as social and community work, given the economic reliance of these roles on tax and the impact automation may have on tax incomes?
I think it's so the short answer is yes. The longer answer is for lots of different reasons. One reason is that many of the roles that are the way I'm interpreting the question is that there's a distinction between paid work and unpaid work. There's lots of things that people do in their lives which is still work, but it just doesn't come with a wage in the market. And I think that distinction is going to become more and more important as we move into a world with less paid work. One reason is that there are roles that we recognize as being socially incredibly important, but don't receive a wage or a large enough wage in the labor market. And I think that mismatch between the social value of what, say, key workers do in the pandemic, for instance, and the wages that many of them receive has been very conspicuous. And I write about this in the book, that if we move to a world in which we rely less and less on the labor market for sharing out prosperity, that wages are less and less a good guide to what it is that as a society we value, then there's an opportunity to perhaps revalue some of those other types of work that don't traditionally receive an income and don't traditionally receive a wage. I think there's also an interesting, I think one aspect is this mismatch between the market value of a lot of work and the social value of a lot of work. I think there's also another issue, which is that around issues of social solidarity, which I think are very important. Today, a sense of social solidarity tends to come from a feeling we're all pulling our economic weight. We're all paying into the collective economic pot through the work that we do or the taxes that we pay. And if we can't find work but are able to work, there's an expectation that we actively look for work or we retrain for work. What do we do in a world where there's less work for people to do? How can people make a contribution? How can people pay into the collective pot? I write a lot in the book about how, well, perhaps we ought to start recognizing non-economic contributions as well as valuable contributions to the community and to the society in which we're all part of. And so I think that's another way in which work, not paid work, but certain types of socially valuable work become more and more significant, more and more important in the future.
Emma asked, how should high schools change their careers education strategies now to benefit young people in the future, especially in more deprived areas? Should we be training a pipeline of digital engineers?
But yeah, so this issue of education, and again, it's something I've spent lots of time writing about. I think we often spend a lot of time thinking about what we teach, about what these technological trends mean for the material that we teach people. But I think what's become clear in this crisis is that there are two other very important parts to the sort of education challenge. One is not what we teach, but how we teach. Until this crisis happened, the way in which we teach, whether it's universities or schools or wherever, hadn't really changed that much for decades. If you were to step in a time machine, go back and walk into a traditional lecture theatre or classroom, it would look remarkably the same as it did 3 months ago. And yet now most education's being done online. And I think, so I think one of the lessons we need to learn from this crisis is how we might be able to use technology to change the way that we teach, to change how we teach. So it's partly what we teach, partly how we teach. I think there's another big thing, which is about when we teach. I think, again, there's a sort of presumption that education is the sort of thing you do at the start of your life. That's when you build up human capital, build it up like an asset, and then as you move through life, you're able to draw down on it. But you only treat it with sort of seriousness and intensity at the start of your career. I think that's a mistake. And I think there is, before this crisis, there was a huge amount of uncertainty about what skills and what capabilities would be valuable in the future. I think as a result of this crisis, there's even more uncertainty than there was before. And the best response to that uncertainty is flexibility, to be willing to retrain and reskill and re-educate throughout life with the same sort of intensity that you might have done at the start of life. So I think thinking about education, we've got to grapple not just with what we teach. Should we be teaching computer science? Should we be teaching people to be problem solvers or creative or so on, but also how we teach and also when we teach.
Thank you. There's a lot of questions, and I know that we started perhaps 5 minutes late, so if it's okay with you, we'll just take another couple of questions.
Of course.
What is your view of social contributions, for example, the work of charities, which aren't done for profit, but which do have a value? Charities often struggle to quantify this or deprioritize this because of the need to keep admin costs low.
And again, I think it sort of ties in with the response before, which was maybe muddled, so it wasn't clear what that response was. But this idea that that there clearly is lots of work that people do, lots of things that people produce that aren't valued by the traditional market mechanism, aren't valued in the traditional labor market. And so there is an opportunity, I think, as we move to a world with less work, to reevaluate some of the work and some of the activities that people do. And that if there's less of an opportunity to pay into the collective pot through the paid work that we do, that there might be an opportunity to recognize some of the either unpaid work that people do or lower paid work or work where it's hard to quantify the value. It ties in a lot with, I write a lot in the book about what I call a conditional basic income as a solution to some of these problems that we might face in a world with less work. And the big change there from a universal basic income, which is a basic income paid to everyone with no conditions attached, is that I think we do need to attach conditions to the basic income for those reasons of social solidarity that I mentioned before. I think in return for a basic income, as a society, we're going to ask one another to make contributions. And if we can't make economic contributions, then we might ask one another to make non-economic contributions. And so that basic income might be conditional on doing certain types of activity. And it might sound radical, but in a sense, if you look at how people spend their time today, which is what those questions hint at, people do lots of very socially valuable work that isn't recognized by, at the moment, the labor market. So 15 million people volunteer, for instance. That's about half the size of the working population in the UK. Volunteering sector is valued at about 50 billion pounds, which is larger than the energy sector. They're really socially valuable, socially useful work that perhaps we can do more to recognize in return for financial support than we currently do at the moment. And these are the sorts of issues and debates that I think we need to be thinking about more and more in a world with less work.
Absolutely. There's a question and sort of comments here from Tony Hay.
Yeah.
Daniel, thank you for your stimulating talk. However, there are surely other factors that will determine the future of humankind. 3 that spring to mind are: 1, the end of Moore's law is here. No longer will computers get smaller, cheaper and faster. So extrapolation from the past Moore's law's world, as in the singularity vision, are not valid. 2, climate change will also surely play an enormous role in changing what we do in the future. And 3, the limits to growth, in that the pie cannot continue to grow for everyone. How do you think such trends as these will interact with your technological vision?
So the Moore's Law one is an interesting one. I should say, again, my work, I'm just reading the question. My work, I don't subscribe to a sort of singularity view. I think those sorts of views are a distraction. I don't rest my arguments on the idea that we're approaching some super intelligence. I don't think that's necessary. I'm wary of predicting the end of Moore's Law, as many people have done in the past, particularly with the progress that's seems to be made in the world of quantum computing, which I find very interesting. My arguments are based on a view that we're going to see systems and machines take on more tasks and activities than they've been able to do in the past. Now, that seems to me to be the direction of travel. The speed of travel, of course, depends upon precisely that first point about how rapid the advances are in the underlying processing power or data storage capability or algorithm design. But for me, that just changes the speed and not the direction. And similarly with, I should say, let me address the third, limits to growth, and the pie cannot continue to grow for everyone. So that global economic pie is already about about $12,000. You only need another 70 years, say, another generation, 2 generations of growth at 2% to quadruple that. The challenge for me, I don't think the challenge is about the size of the pie. The challenge far more for me is about how that pie is shared out, the distributional challenge. People don't automatically get an equal slice of that pie. That seems to me, when I look out in the years to come, that distributional challenge seems to me to be the more fundamental one than the growth challenge. I'm more confident that we're going to see continued growth than we are going to see a capability to share out the proceeds of that growth evenly and fairly. And that goes to the initial question about agency. Our ability to create institutions that share prosperity in society seems to me to be one of the most important tasks that we face at the moment.
I think that's a very good place to leave it. There are so many questions, but the chat can be saved, and we can look at those after the session's finished. But I would like to thank you, Daniel, so much for a very, very stimulating and thought-provoking session this afternoon. It's clear from the number of comments and questions that's come in that everybody is engaged with this issue hugely. And I think, obviously, you're quite right in noting how the pandemic has reshaped and reframed people's engagements with this issue, and perhaps made people much more mindful and thoughtful about how they want to go forward in the creation of their own futures in relation to technology. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you for coming to Southampton, even virtually. And thank you everybody for joining the lecture. It's wonderful to see so many names and so many comments. The thank yous are pouring in, fascinating. Thank you, that was great. So a big thank you from all of us, Daniel.
And likewise, thank you so much. Such a privilege to be part of this series. So thank you very much for hosting me.